Americans have long seen their soul, their failures, and their triumphs through their writers. No other country has produced such a noble body of literature as the United States. Hello, I'm Jane Kasmarek, and welcome to the Great American Authors Series. In this fourth episode of the Great American Authors Series, we shall see America move onto the world stage, and as a consequence, lose its innocence. Its writers now begin to struggle with the problems that accompany this transition to modernization and industrialization. Some of these authors will lament the loss of this innocence, while others will seize the opportunity to break from the old and create new and startling literary forms. They include E Cummings and T.S. Eliot, but also F. Scott Fitzgerald, who initiates the era of the lost generation writers, the greatest innovation in the history of American literature. In this segment, the first of many American ethnic writers finds a voice. He is Hispanic, William Carlos Williams.
His life was a study in contrasts. He became a doctor, dedicated to helping people, but he was also a poet. His roots were the artistic traditions of his Puerto Rican mother, yet he established an American style of poetry. He wrote on commonplace, everyday things, yet his verse was marked by vivid observations. He was William Carlos Williams, and he was one of the greatest American poets of the 20th century.
So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens. The Red Wheelbarrow, by William Carlos Williams.
William Carlos Williams was born in Rutherford, New Jersey in 1883. Growing up, he attended schools in Europe, as well as Horace Mann High School in the U.S., where he started writing poetry. In 1902, he entered the University of Pennsylvania Medical School to fulfill his ambition to become a doctor. While at medical school, he met Ezra Pound, the American writer who helped shape American literature in the 20th century. The two men would remain lifelong friends and correspondents. In 1913, Pound arranged for the publication of Williams's first collection, The Tempers. Throughout his life, Williams searched for a fresh style of poetry that was uniquely American, a style that embraced America's regional dialogues and idioms. Eventually, he founded a style that was based on everyday life and the lives of ordinary Americans. It was a style as American as jazz, simple yet filled with profound insight and brilliant imagery.
Shadows cast by the street light, under the stars, the head is tilted back, the long shadow of the legs presumes a world taken for granted, on which the cricket trills. Shadows, by William Carlos Williams.
William Carlos Williams won the Pulitzer Prize in 1963, the same year he died.
Following the death of Emily Dickinson, American poetry faded from the literary scene. But at the opening of the 20th century, a new literary realism led a resurgence of American poetry, and the father of that resurgence was Carl Sandburg.
Quoting the English writer Rudyard Kipling, Carl Sandburg said of himself, "I will be the word of the people. Mine will be the bleeding mouth from which the gag is snatched. I will say everything." No statement better expressed the goal of the 20th century realist poets or their leader, Carl Sandburg. The early 20th century's realist poets were a varied bunch who came from all walks of life. They sang a song of America, of the big city's gritty, mean streets, and of the country's rich farmlands and wild forests. They sang of the common man and woman. They sang of government corruption and industry's rape of nature. And among all these giants, Carl Sandburg was realism's master. Using everyday speech, he helped Americans understand the life of the nation. Sandberg was born on January 6, 1878, in Galesburg, Illinois. At 13, he left school. He worked odd jobs and traveled the country, riding the rails as a hobo and served in the Army. In 1912, he moved to Chicago, where he worked as a newspaper journalist, gaining fame as a poet and eventually financial success as a biographer. His series, Abraham Lincoln, won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1940. But it is as a poet that Sandberg is chiefly remembered. His best-known poem, Chicago, contrasts the brutality and ugliness of big city life with the might and energy of industry.
Hog butcher for the world, tool maker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads and the nation's freight handler, stormy, husky, brawling, city of the big shoulders. They tell me you are wicked, and I believe them, for I have seen your painted women under the gas lamps luring the farm boys. And they tell me you are crooked, and I answer yes, it is true. I have seen the gunman kill and go free to kill again. And they tell me you are brutal. And my reply is, on the faces of women and children, I have seen the marks of wanted hunger. And having answered so, I turn once more to those who sneer at this my city, and I give them back the sneer. And I say to them, come and show me another city, with lifted heads singing so proud to be alive, and coarse, and strong, and cunning.
By the 1920s, America's literary scene had grown from the 19th century's elite group of poets, published in a few magazines, to a true cross-section of America, mostly thanks to literary magazines that showcased relatively unknown authors. Poetry Magazine, a Chicago literary journal founded by Harriet Monroe, launched the careers of Sandberg along with Edgar Lee Masters and Vachel Lindsay, linking these three in the minds of Americans as the leaders of the realist movement. Masters' Spoon River Anthology gave voice to the lives of Midwesterners through the imaginary citizens of an imaginary town. Lindsay's strong chant-like rhythms and vivid imagery painted a powerful portrait of America's greatest president in his poem, Abraham Lincoln Walks at Midnight. Sandberg continued to be the voice of the nation until his death on July 22, 1967.
No one expressed what the old America was, the intellectual elite of the East Coast, better than Edith Wharton.
The beginning of the 20th century was a time of transition for America. For over 100 years, the country had pushed outward across the continent. Now, with all the land mapped and settled, America looked inward and began an even greater adventure, reform. America's writers were a part of this movement. Muckrakers like Ida Tarbell created a new form of literature that investigated government's corruption and industry's inhumanity. At the same time, women's unique American identity began to emerge in the arts through painters such as Mary Cassatt and Georgia O'Keeffe, singers like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith, and dancers like Isadora Duncan and Martha Graham. This emergence also happened in literature, where one woman stood like a giant, capturing the American character with greater pathos and variety than any other novelist. Her remarkable range as a writer culminated in a Pulitzer Prize for her literary masterpiece, The Age of Innocence. She was Edith Wharton, literary dean of the Lost Generation, which featured writers like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Willa Cather, and Gertrude Stein. Edith Wharton was born Edith Newbold Jones in New York City on January 24, 1862. Her family were wealthy New Yorkers. Schooled at home, she had access to her father's extensive library. In 1885, at age 23, Edith Jones married Teddy Wharton, a wealthy socialite. The two lived a life of luxury, with homes in New York, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. In 1897, Wharton published her first novel, The Decoration of Houses, which savaged America's wealthy class through their gaudy and overdressed homes. After that, she averaged nearly a novel a year until her death in 1937. Wharton's marriage to Teddy was ill-fated from the start. He shared none of her artistic or intellectual pursuits. In fact, her failing marriage would form one of the core themes of her writing. Other themes would be the wealthy class of America's Gilded Age, marriages of convenience, and romantic love. In 1908, at age 46, Wharton herself discovered passionate love with Morton Fullerton, a journalist friend of Henry James. Wharton divorced her husband 4 years later and settled permanently in Paris, a city she loved. Living on the income from her novels, Wharton founded one of the more dynamic literary salons, attracting American expatriates such as F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, and even an ex-president, Teddy Roosevelt. In 1920, Wharton became the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction with her masterpiece, The Age of Innocence. Set in New York's Gilded Age in the 1870s, the novel captures the struggle for love and independence within America's wealthiest class through the characters Newland Archer and the Countess Ellen Olenska. Wharton continued to live in Paris until her death from a stroke in 1937.
4 American writers from distinctive backgrounds challenged every rule of writing and morality. They were E. Cummings, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, and Henry Miller. Their body of work produced what would become the new model of American literature.
A new generation of American writers was rising. They emerged from an era when it seemed the whole world was mad with war. An era when America had shed its isolationism and strode the world's stage as a savior. An era when American political progressives, La Follette, Roosevelt, and Wilson were replaced by the corruption of Harding, the cult of enterprise, and the greed of Wall Street. Out of this era came a startling new chapter in American literature, led by a new generation of writers. A talented and expressive group who would change the way writers wrote poems and novels. Unafraid to pursue new themes and new ideas, they were the innovators. E. Cummings was this era's most unconventional poet. His poetry rattled the established rules of structure and composition by rejecting standard punctuation and capitalization and twisting the arrangement of sentences. He even spelled his own name, E. Cummings, in lowercase letters. And like many other gifted writers of his generation, Cummings rejected America's social conformity and emphasized the individual over society.
Buffalo Bill's defunct, who used to ride a water-smooth silver stallion and break 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pigeons, just like that. Jesus, he was a handsome man. And what I want to know is, how do you like your blue-eyed boy, Mr. Death?
Born and raised in America, Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, like many of the nation's young artists, became disillusioned with the country's literary scene. So in their 20s, they left the United States for Europe's more vibrant cultural milieu. Although Pound was an admired poet and essayist in his own right, his greatest impact would be as a mentor to American and European writers. He advised them, "The history of an art is the history of its masterwork, not of failures or mediocrity." Pound helped develop the talents of American poets William Carlos Williams, Robert Frost, and T.S. Eliot, who wrote The Hollow Men.
We are the hollow men. We are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. Alas, our dried voices when we whisper together. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper.
T.S. Eliot captured the angst and quiet desperation that had become part of modern life. One of the greatest innovators of the 20th century, winning the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1948, T.S. Eliot's masterpieces, The Wasteland and The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, would reshape American literature. The odd man among these innovators was the novelist Henry Miller. George Orwell wrote of him, "The only imaginative prose writer of the slightest value who has appeared among the English-speaking races in some time." Unlike Cummings, Pound and Eliot, who called attention to the moral, spiritual, and societal bankruptcies of the United States, Miller took on the one subject that was utterly taboo: sex. His novels Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn, Blatant and Unashamed, were written in Paris in the 1930s. They were banned from publication in the United States until 1961. Miller's eventual success would make legitimate a style and content of literature that had become commonplace at the turn of the 21st century, explicitly writing about sex. Sex aside, he was also a brilliant writer of the English language.
Suddenly bells begin to toll. A weird, unearthly music, as if I had been translated to the steppes of Central Asia. Some ring out with a long, lingering roll. Some erupt drunkenly, maudlinly. And now it is quiet again, except for a last note that barely grazes the silence of the night. Just a faint, high gong, snuffed out like a flame.
While the innovators changed the way American authors structured literature, the next generation of writers, the so-called lost generation, would change the way Americans lived, the way they felt, and the way they thought.